Welcome to the Pacific Southwest MHTTC's Rising Practices and Policies Learning Series. Today we're talking about bullying and belonging. My name is Christy Silva. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm our Region's Associate Director and the moderator for today's session. Today's session will offer an overview of what bullying is and how it shows up. Then we'll hear from three incredible regional leaders about rising practices and policies that explore current issues related to bullying prevention and belonging, and also the actionable guidance that's creative, responsive, and effective. So each session has been specifically developed for each of our three areas of programming. And while today's session focuses on topics for the general mental health workforce, all are welcome, of course, and we hope to see you in our upcoming sessions for the youth and young adult mental health workforce. I'm going to pause for a minute. We're going to move on to our content, but we do encourage you to revisit these questions and the additional slide on the importance of belonging after this session. Grounding information so that we're on the same page, because it is important that we ground ourselves in a clear definition of bullying for this series and beyond. So bullying and harassment are often used interchangeably when talking about hurtful or harmful behavior. They're very similar, but in terms of definition, there is an important difference. So bullying and harassment are similar as they are both about power and control, actions that harm another person physically or emotionally, an imbalance of power between the target and the individual demonstrating the negative behavior, and the target having difficulty stopping the action directed at them. The distinction then between bullying and harassment is that when the bullying behavior directed at the target is also based on a protected class, that behavior is then defined as harassment. Protected classes can include race, color, religion, age, disability, and national origin, for example. So now let's turn to today's focus. So interrupting bullying and fostering belonging for the general mental health workforce. Our panel today will offer perspectives of what bullying it is and how it manifests in workspaces and specific population communities, including different ethnicities, elders, neurodiverse youth, and their parents. You'll see that our panel is rich with expertise from a diversity of roles, from academic to nonprofit systems. We're pleased that Dr. Tran, Jenny Pardini, and Robin Kincaid are here to offer their viewpoints. We're so grateful that the three of you will join us and share with us your wisdom today. Thank you for your time. Dr. Tran, we'll start with you.
Let me share a little bit about who I am and why I'm interested in this work. I am the daughter of Vietnamese refugee boat people resettled here in San Diego under the Family Reunification Act in 1981. And I went to school here in San Diego where I experienced myself a lot of harassment based on my heritage to Vietnam and being refugees. I'm also now a parent to two little ones who are, one's a toddler and one is school age. He's a fifth grader now who has also over the last 5 years experienced much bullying at school. Professionally, I am trained as a community psychologist. I'm a professor of counseling and school psychology, and I'm also the executive director to our training clinic, the Center for Community Counseling and Engagement. And so the work that I'm going to share today brings together some of the scholarship and some of the research that I've done over the last 20 years here in California, in Chicago, and in the Boston area. So I wanted to kind of share, where the field is right now. The scholarship has long been focused on blatant kind of sexism, racism, these larger, broad scale types of discrimination. And what we've seen over the last probably about 2 decades is this shift to thinking about subtle or covert biases. So many of you are probably very familiar with the word microaggressions. It's used, I think, very frequently now in our kind of pop culture, but not a lot of people know exactly what it is or what makes it so special and unique. So I'll share a little bit about that in our in the psychology research. But racism, sexism, kind of broad, these big discrimination isms focuses on a system of oppression, right? And it typically describes a person or behavior. So they're large, they're blatant, they're big. And so what we're talking about now is that we're focusing more on these kind of covert, subtle biases that are much more subtle, and they tend to focus on the impact on victims. And so over the years, there's been this shift to thinking about who does the harassment to now thinking about who is impacted by it. So there's a much stronger focus on victims. It used to be the case that we would focus on the use of slurs, right? The use of derogatory language. But now we're thinking more, because we're thinking about microaggressions and how it hurts us. We're thinking more about environments, so schools and workplaces that allow slurs to go unchecked. And so it becomes much more controllable if we think about, well, individuals may not be discriminatory if they were in an environment that they knew would not tolerate it, right? So this shift allows schools and workplaces to identify many more bullies and harassers than we previously had. So previously, we had this we would have to identify folks, right? You can kind of see this now still in the way that we identify hate crimes. It's much more difficult, even though we know there's a lot of harm. So why do we care about subtle biases, right? Students, what we know in the literature is that students learn more when they have less biased teachers. There's less biased teachers are more likely to receive higher teaching evaluations. Less biased people have better interpersonal relationships. Subtle biases have been linked to slower pace of career advancement. And we know that subtle biases are also related to biased hiring practices. So it really behooves us to think about how we can create environments, workplaces, people who are less biased in these subtle ways, not just in these big, large, blatant ways. Next slide, please. So microaggressions, so just so that we're all clear and on the same page, are verbal as well as nonverbal and visual actions, behaviors, and environmental indignities. And they're often perpetuated intentionally or unintentionally by well-meaning individuals that ultimately invalidate and communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. Most importantly, is that microaggressions occur even if you are a well-meaning individual and you did not intend it to be hurtful, but that ultimately what it does is we're focusing on, but was harm done or not, right? So this is what we commonly talk about as whether, if it's about impact, then really we're talking about microaggressions. Was there harm done? And we know that over time, there is an exponential effect of microaggressions, and that ultimately when the individual learns that they have been microaggressed, that even if this was years ago, there will still be a negative impact in the future. So the way that we bring this all together now is that we had previously known that there were implicit biases, right? That there are these inherent biases that we have been socialized with, and they come across in such ways as folks believing that maybe English ability is more important than content knowledge, or that white culture and English language is superior to other cultures and languages. And that type of a bias then leads to microaggressions, which could look like multilingual students receiving more assignment feedback on grammar than actual course content. There could be students and colleagues who mock the accents or sentence structures, right? Sometimes folks will talk about grammar Nazis, or folks who are really obsessed with making sure we speak perfect English. Well, that often comes from an implicit bias, right? So that we see that there's a connection between these two. Microaggressions then will lead to are the resulting inequities and the gaps and disparities that we see. So then we see things like multilingual students disengaging and dropping out of school. Students will stop talking and isolate, as well as colleagues who feel as though they don't belong because they have been microaggressed, which then tells them that there are these implicit biases that are in the context they're in. And what we know is that these understanding the connection with these tells us where the intervention points are. And so the intervention points are between each of these spots. So we need to be able to prevent folks from moving from implicit biases that we all inherently have because we are a product of our socialization and the environments that we are in. And so the implicit, if we can prevent folks from taking their implicit biases and turning them into microaggressions, then we could perhaps prevent them from becoming inequities. But it may be the case that we don't prevent them all. And so there must be interventions then that we could simultaneously do when microaggressions occur. And so then intervention points where when a microaggression occurs, are there actions such as many folks are now using restorative justice circles to build connection and build relationships to prevent the microaggressions from resulting in inequities. Next slide, please. So it's so important then that we respond to biases that are in the environment because all of our training thus far has typically focused on trying to prevent folks from having their implicit biases come to life, right, through microaggressions. But the reality is microaggressions will happen. We should all expect to be microaggressors and to have experiences as victims of microaggressions. And we know that the only ineffective response is ignoring the incident, right? It will allow the incident itself to fester, right? We don't just cover the wound, do so while prioritizing the victim's feelings. So the power of the microaggressions work that has been done is that it focuses on victims' feelings, not on whether the incident was intentional or unintentional. Because if you remember from the definition, intentionality does not matter. It matters that someone was hurt. And so by focusing on the impact of the incident, we then can see how we might be able to solve and ensure that it doesn't result in any further inequities. So one of the ways that we do this is that I think a lot of us have been trained not to do actually, is that if it happened in public, the resolution should also happen publicly. So private apologies and acknowledgments don't clear harm to those who have witnessed an incident, and it also doesn't give as much validation to the individual who has been harmed. And so if you think about students who have heard something derogatory happen in the classroom that was subtle, right? That there was someone's English was corrected in the classroom, or perhaps the word American was used to describe one group of Euro descendant individuals, excluding others from the group, and perhaps that then is brought to the teacher's attention. Rather than pulling the student aside to apologize, it's really important for that teacher to be able to talk to the entire class and to be able to clear the air, because others will have witnessed that this incident happened and been harmed by the incident, but not been able to have the same resolution as the individual who was harmed. We also see this with colleagues where if there was a difficult conversation that happened during a staff meeting, and individuals were unable to stand up for one another in the meeting, then afterwards, many folks, victims of harassment, will say, how come you all didn't stand up for me? And they'll get the apologies and the validation after the meeting, while they were left to be harmed in the meeting by themselves. And so, again, if you want to support someone, the idea is, where can the support happen for the utmost amount of protection and support? And that would have to happen in public, right? And for policy and administrative responses, we have to really think about how we can consider amplification and strength building of victims alongside bias and bullying prevention and interventions. Right now, the field is is populated with many diversity trainings, microaggression trainings, implicit bias trainings, requests for ethnic studies, and bullying prevention and intervention programming, but very little is done for the actual victim, right? We don't see enough focus on, resiliency building, helping folks to learn the skills to be able to stand up to, preparation for bias type training, which we know is one of the strongest types of evidence-based practices that come from families, is socialization that prepares folks for bullying. Can we move to the next slide? So ultimately, it's important to remember that everyone is biased, right? We all have a favorite. I always like to think about, we all have a favorite flavor of ice cream, and yet we've never tried all of the different flavors of ice cream. that makes us biased, right? It doesn't make us a bad person, but the acknowledgement that we are biased allows us then to move forward and think about prevention and intervention programs for our biases that we hold. Being perfectly unbiased is not ideal nor possible. So the goal that we have must be cultural humility and openness, meaning that we must then have personal sturdiness, awareness, and self-compassion as a starting point to disruption of implicit bias and microaggression cycles, right? We must be sturdy enough to receive feedback that we have harmed someone, that we are capable of apologizing and taking that feedback. We also must have the cultural humility to accept that we cannot change all of the environment and that we must be able to be open to the possibility that that of hearing that the changes that we are attempting to make may not be impacting victims the way that we would like. So consider classroom and workplace environmental factors that might be contributing to the impact of harm, right? So not just in preventing the actual incident itself, but rather also factors that might be impacting how much harm a person feels after the fact. Center the perspective of the person harmed, not just the perpetrator. I think we think about this only in the event of an incident, but to also be thinking about folks who are most likely to be harmed and how might we think about how they would like to be addressed. When I think about schools and I think about even my own child who will report bullying, oftentimes we focus on consequences for the perpetrator without thinking about, how we might center the perspective of the person who has been harmed without further perpetuating the harm that has been done. So often teachers will pull a student out in order to talk with the child, then send the child over to school counselor to have additional conversation. But we're not paying attention to is the fact that now this child has been isolated from their support groups while the perpetrator is allowed to stay in the classroom with the entire class. So further othering the person who is already most likely to be victimized, right? So in this process, how is it possible for us to validate the hurt that has been done without further perpetuating the hurt and allowing the environment to also feel as though it too understands and validates the harm that has been done? So consider training to support victims, not just training to stop people from perpetrating the harm that has been done. I think that's kind of the biggest lesson here is that what we know in the literature is that the more subtle the harm is, the more pain and the stronger the impact will be. And part of that has to do with the idea that overt, obvious types of harm are very easy for individuals to externalize, right? If someone says a derogatory term, then it's easy for me to say, oh, well, that was racist, so I don't need to bother with that. That person is racist. And I can let it go. I don't have to dwell on it. But for incidences that are less obvious, right? An individual who might say, oh, you go to this school? That's interesting. I didn't know. I didn't realize that it was so hard. It was so easy to get into this program, that someone saying a subtle remark like that might be indicating that this person does not belong to this setting. And so the victim who experiences this has less opportunity to say, whoa, that's racist, right? And then rather must think, wow, I keep getting comments like this. It must mean that something is wrong with me. And so if something is wrong with me, then I must then it must be something that's wrong with me, and I have to do something about this. And so the opportunity to internalize that message is much higher, and that's where we see kind of this multiplicative effect, where one small harm leads to another small harm, and these harms have nowhere to go. And so people are ruminating on them, and you see a stronger impact. So therefore, our interventions and prevention programs must focus on the actual harm that's being done on a much more small and subtle scale, and the long-term nature of these harms.
Thank you, Dr. Tran.
I'm really grateful to be included on this panel. I do work with older adults now, but I actually have a background. I taught high school for about a decade, so I have a lot of experience also working with younger students, and I really appreciate being part of this conversation. a big question that I was thinking about is, how do we understand when something might be considered bullying versus actually moving into a legal space of elder abuse? And I have some really great resources listed at the end of this, which will validate a lot of the things that come on the bullying side here, but especially in settings of senior living spaces or senior centers, this has been observed where some sort of conflict will come up, and a lot of times staff doesn't want to deal with it because they're saying, oh, they'll work it out, they're adults, but that is not always the case. And so, like younger victims of bullying, older adults still experience many of those emotions that come along with being bullied. And unfortunately, it can lead to isolation, just like Melly was touching on, that being separated from the group, which actually can make them a lot more vulnerable to a lot of health implications and more likely to be a victim of elder abuse. And I just wanted to point out that elder abuse does happen across a variety of situations, but it can be peer to peer. So thinking about the elder abuse side of things, what could have been perceived as bullying can actually move into a space that is set by law as elder abuse. And with mental health, if you're a mandated reporter, you want to think about it in the same way that you would if you thought you needed to report to CPS if you're used to working with children. APS is Adult Protective Services, and it's for adults of a certain age, but also adults between 18 and 64 if they're considered a dependent adult, could also be someone you might need to report. So it may not be an elder in those cases, but just making sure people know about that. There are 4 categories that elder abuse generally falls into, and that's financial, physical, they lump emotional and psychological together, and neglect. We're only really going to think about the physical and the emotional, psychological for today. So I recognize that I'm in California, so I dropped in the California Welfare and Institution Code. If you are outside of California, you may want to check your local area for what they will define as elder abuse. But under the California Welfare and Institution Code, it's assault, battery, unreasonable physical restraint. It can also include prolonged or continual deprivation of food and water, and we're going to talk about why that can be really dangerous in a moment. It does include sexual assault and also use of physical or chemical restraint to control someone. And then touching on the emotional or psychological, I pulled from the CDC to say that it refers to verbal or nonverbal behavior that inflicts anguish, mental pain, fear, or distress on an older adult. So that's the context of what we're looking at. Things that will look like physical abuse. It can be hitting, beating, pushing, shoving, right? Also, someone may be just trying to cause harm. So if they themselves are not physically strong enough to cause the harm that they're intending, that doesn't mean that they're not causing physical abuse. It can be attempting or using or attempting to use a weapon, and it also unreasonably restraining. So signs to look out for. If you are seeing that a person has injuries that are not being properly cared for, if you're finding cuts and bruises and discoloration, and there's not an explanation for how that happened. I like to pause on dehydration and malnutrition because dehydration doesn't just necessarily mean like not being given some water. It could also be not being adequately hydrated over a lengthy period of time. And what can happen as a physical symptom of that is that a person may start to look like they're having symptoms of dementia. And that is very dangerous because if someone is trying to take advantage of the older adult and they can have that person looking like they're not clear of mind, that could trigger different things like durable power of attorney or advanced healthcare directives, putting the potential abuser in the position of power to now make legal or healthcare decisions for that older adult. So we really want to make sure that people's basic needs are being met. If you're talking to someone and they're exhibiting signs of depression and fear and anger, hysteria, withdrawal, or weight loss that doesn't have some sort of accompanying health reason, these can all be signs that there's some sort of abuse happening. And also soiled clothing or bedding. So I just wanted to talk about those signs to look out for if you are meeting with someone and seeing these things, the emotional and psychological. So um, humiliation or disrespect, yelling things at the older person. And I think one that we see a lot of times in families where this is happening is that threat that, oh, we're gonna put you away. Like if you don't do what we say, then you're not gonna be here, you're gonna be isolated and no one's gonna come see you. So things like that can really beat down someone's psychological state and make them, very vulnerable to then having to comply with something that may not be what they want to do. Also, we see in situations where someone is being isolated by a potential caregiver, by a caregiver, not potential, but by a caregiver, it creates a potential for abuse because that one person can now say, you see, I'm the one who shows up for you. I'm here and I do things for you. No one else comes. And since I'm here for you, you should transfer the house into my name or you should put me on a bank account. So that can be a very dangerous manipulative tool to gain control with someone. And then just also verbal and nonverbal threats can also fall into this category. So, signs you may see from the person that you're talking to, if they are hesitant to speak openly about their caregiver or in front of their caregiver, there could be some sort of control that's happening there where they don't feel comfortable speaking in front of that person. If the things that they're telling you just are implausible, you're like, I really don't think that you could have gone to that place with this person on that day or done that kind of activity because maybe their physical limitations or their transportation limitations. But this person is just telling these stories to try and cover something else that's happening. Also, if they seem confused or disoriented, and that could also be related to some of those physical things we talked about. If they're exhibiting exaggerated fear or anger, or you're noticing withdrawal or helplessness, these are all possible signs. And a big one to look out for is if that person is not being allowed to meet alone with others, because there could be some control trying to say, oh, we don't want this person telling what's really happening. So we're going to make sure that they don't get time where they could do that. So what happens when an older adult says, hey, something is wrong? Well, there are legal remedies, there's civil restraining orders. Um, those can be granted for up to 5 years, and they automatically get entered into the law enforcement system so that if the person does have to call because someone has come and there is a restraining order, like that will be taken care of quickly, and the law enforcement will already know that that's in place. Criminal protective orders can also be put in place. Those are more of a short term, and they can be ordered by a district attorney on behalf of an older adult who is either the victim or the witness to the crime. And criminal prosecution is there to support this. There's also victim and witness services that is there to support older adults when this happens. One thing that I also really want to make sure people know about, and I know Nellie already touched on restorative justice, is that there's been a lot of work in the elder space, the elder justice space on restorative justice in the last 5 or so years, I would say, is when I've heard the most about it. I'm sure it was also happening before then, but you can find a lot more information about it now. And so that is a form of justice that is going to recognize that the abuse violates the relationship, not just the law. And it's going to focus on trying to heal the relationship by counting in what the person who has experienced the elder abuse or the, violence or maybe bullying, to help make sure that they're feeling made whole by the result of what is going to come from the restorative justice practices. And the goal is then to heal those wounds or improve the offender's behavior so that people can move forward and continue to be in a relationship. There's also some really great information in a link I put in the resources from Dr. Patrick Barber, and he does an entire talk that's on YouTube that you can listen to, but I borrowed this from him because it's really important to think about that impact. So it can be in a lot of different parts of a person's experience. There's that cognitive, I'm being bullied, I think everyone hates me, or that psychological, as a result, I'm feeling hopeless, I don't want to go out, I'm going to stay in my room. And then that physical fear can be also part of the problem of, I'm afraid someone's going to try and trip me or push me, and then I'm really going to be hurt and I'm not going to be able to take care of myself. And also that can in the end lead to this behavioral, I'm afraid of all of these things. I don't want to be around these people anyway. And so now I'm just not going to go out. And that isolation is so dangerous because it's that risk factor for elder abuse. It has lots of implications on people's health over time. And so I'm going to just jump to that second point. It is both a risk factor and a result of elder abuse, which is why it is such a complex thing. And unfortunately, it can be used as a manipulation tool by the abuser. So we want to think about all of those things when making sure that we're trying to support older adults in the way that they continue to interact over their lifetime. Some takeaways are that staff do need training on identifying elder abuse. Behavior policies need to be clear and present and talked about, so it's not just something people ignore, but people are aware of, and they really understand the impact of those things and how it creates an environment that's safe for everyone. And in that, we're treating each other with respect, caring, compassion, and we're creating a community where people do feel like they belong. And there's lots of ways to introduce those concepts. This is how we do things here, or here we're respectful, we're civil. It's okay to disagree, but we're not going to bully someone. We're going to have a conversation. And then creating opportunities for the bully or the abuser to learn how to manage their own emotions, and also resisting that temptation to just punish the person because they may really need help and not just simply to be rejected also from the group. So you can report to Adult Protective Services. Those are the California number and website. I recognize that people are from all over, but I put what I most commonly work with. Also, many facilities have a person that's called an ombudsman who can help investigate abuse or neglect if the person is in a nursing home or boarding care facility, and they facilitate between the sites. So they don't actually work for the facility, but they facilitate between the resident and either the facility or other residents, or possibly oversee documents being signed to prevent elder abuse. And then there's some different links there to different resources about topics that I talked about. So please, I invite you, if you're interested in this, to check those out. And hopefully I did really close to my time and I'm ready to pass it over.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Robin Kincaid. Robin, you're up.
Appreciate the opportunity to talk about it from the parent perspective. I work for a parent training and information center, Nevada PEP, and we are helping families that have experienced bullying. Many of the families have children with disabilities. And as a parent of a child with a disability, I remember the day my child was bullied. My child has an intellectual disability, and I remember hearing from other children how her head was put in the sink and was all wet. And they did that because they wanted to see what the curls looked like, and continued to find opportunities to get her hair wet in different restrooms. And I can remember, working with the school, it was quite the experience. So we often have these lived experiences as parents, and I've been with the Parent Center for about 24 years. So because of the amount of bullying experiences that families have had in Nevada, we have worked on developing a Safe Allies program, and that's to promote information and education on bullying prevention. We provide trainings, podcasts, videos, materials to parents so they know the steps so that they can take if their child experiences bullying. We do encourage you to look at our nvpep.org website. It's a great opportunity to look at some of the resources that we have. So October is the National Bullying Prevention Month. And, we are actually celebrating it, or actually trying to promote this spirit of bullying prevention by a campaign that we called I Care, We Care. And I Care, We Care is about basically creating an ocean of kindness. And so we're always looking for messages of kindness. If you're interested in putting a message, we'll put it up on our wall on our site. But that is why I have the background today, that I Care, We Care. So, the difference between bullying and harassment is one of the types of things that we are teaching families. So students with disabilities in particular are often targeted for bullying because of their disability. we do know that there's two types of things that attract a bully: isolation and vulnerability. My daughter actually has both. Because she has an intellectual disability, she often wouldn't necessarily be with other children. She would be, more isolated, even on the playground. And she also looked very vulnerable. So those two things can often, create a situation where she's more likely to be bullied. So the difference in the harassment is shown very clearly in the Dear Colleague letter of 2014. And that really outlines the obligations of schools to ensure that students with disabilities are entitled to free, appropriate public education. The school has an obligation to address disability-based harassment. There are, legal protections. And one of the things that we're reminding families that children always have a right to learn at school. And so anything that prevents children, from learning, including bullying, must be addressed by the school. And so it actually can result in the denial of free, appropriate public education. So the Office for Civil Rights does investigations that might look at those kinds of things. And they're looking at questions like, when investigating a disability harassment, they consider, is a student with a disability bullied by one or more students? Was the bullying conduct sufficiently serious to create a hostile environment? Many times we recognize that term hostile environment in the workplace, but we fail sometimes to recognize it in the school setting. So children with disabilities or children that are bullied in particular can feel as though they're in a very much of a hostile environment when the bullying continues. And of course, did the school know of the bullying, or should it have known of the conduct? One of the things that Nevada has done over the years is create some very strong anti-bullying legislation. And we have many instances led the nation and the types of things that schools are going to be required to do, including the threat of losing a professional license if you fail to acknowledge, report, or address the bullying. So it has really changed in the last, I would say, 10 years in particular, that there's a stronger focus on making sure that schools are addressing the bullying. But families that call our center, they're often unaware that bullying has become disability harassment. They often are not recognizing the need to advocate for their children in situations where adults, have to act so that children feel safe at school. So many of the chronic absenteeism, which is a very hot topic right now, because we do want kids back in school, and we know that kids are still suffering the effects of the pandemic, but many of the absenteeism is related to children not being safe at school. And so the chronic bullying can really create a situation where children have said, well, I'm just not going to go to school. I can't be in that situation. I can't tolerate that. And so we remember a family that called Nevada PEP and was really concerned because their child had a suspension that occurred in the school and didn't want to go to school. And when the family was interviewing and talking with their child about the suspension and the school administration, they found out that the student deliberately was having this very bad interaction with the teacher so that they could be suspended, because the bullying was going to start the moment they got to that bus stop. And it had, been a continual problem for that student. And so students would be willing to, experience punishment versus, getting hurt or getting attacked. And so we're just really seeing that the changes that bullying have done. How did it turn into this epidemic? Why are the kids being subjected to, maybe angry online texts or messages and even like cyber attacks for just making like an offhand comment or in an unpopular post? We just kind of have to ask ourselves in some respects, how did we get here? Well, the difference today is that it's certainly more physical. Um, it was maybe physical, 40, 50 years ago, but it was different. We are seeing some very much long-term and life-threatening injuries that students experience because the reaction or sometimes the overreaction causes children to experience some pain. But the bullies aren't the same as they were. It really can go from something very simple and it can really grow into something to where we have multiple students involved. And so it does look different in our today's society. And often students that we hear about or families tell us about, they often don't even recognize how their behavior affects others. So we're getting calls from families that their children are bullied, but we're also getting calls from families where their child is the bully. And one of the things that we've really recognized is that we need to address the needs of both bully and the target of bullying. If we don't do that, we really don't be able to make a difference or make a change or help that student. So we have to figure out what are the needs of both of those individuals. So many of the, even the teen suicides that we've seen across the country have been the result of students dominating or sharing power and demanding that students actually take their life. Many of these students are very vulnerable and they do not have the self-esteem, and the self-harm seems to be the answer. Very frightening. So children are easily pushed and motivated to do some very drastic kinds of behaviors because of chronic bullying. It's very difficult. So what we want kids to do is to tell. Often, I remember I actually worked in a school many, many years ago, and I remember someone telling me on the first day, if they come up and tell you something, tell them that we don't take tattling here, but we have to listen to kids. We have to be able to teach them the difference between telling and tattling. And it's very important that we do not shut kids down when they need to tell us something, which kind of goes to the fact that not only do we want kids to tell us, we want parents to be involved. Maybe my parents years ago would have said, let the school work it out or let you work it out. Not anymore. Our work at the Parent Center is to support the families as they respond to bullying, whether we're helping them with a template letter or a sample letter, or encouraging them to talk to their child, listen to their story. Many children, may not even be able to identify that the behavior of another child is bullying. And for some children with more significant disabilities, it's kind of difficult for them to determine or understand that they are a target. My own daughter, she thought they were just having fun with her. She didn't understand, what they were doing, or that they were using maybe getting her hair wet as amusement, or they were having fun with that. And so, and again, it could have escalated to something more serious than that, but it really did show me on a personal note how I needed to respond and work with the school. We also encourage parents to recognize the reaction. So when you first find out that your child is being bullied, you want to march down to that school, or you want to write the strongest letter you have. We encourage families to think about it as a process, and that we're going to take some steps, and that we're going to work toward making sure that child has a safety plan that is going to help the situation. In other words, make sure that that child is safe. Some of the reactions that parents may have is like, I wish I'd done something sooner, or I don't understand why this is happening to my child. I mean, she's a really cute, precious little girl. Why would somebody even do this to her? So sometimes it's just beyond comprehension. And then I'm angry. I'm angry at the kid, I'm angry, or, at the bully, I'm angry at the bully's parents. And then I feel helpless. I know my children have to go to school, and I'm not quite sure exactly how I'm going to make sure that that happens and that they're safe. So also helping about the vulnerability and the isolation, helping what can we do to make changes in that area. And if a child has a significant disability, we also want to make sure that it's not related to maybe a gender identity-based bullying, or that the child is being teased or harassed because of the fact that they are transgender, or that they are having some questions about their sexual orientation. So we really want to make sure that that's not, again, that's a part of harassment, and that has to be responded to as well. But helping families, report this bullying. In Nevada, we have a single point of entry kind of system to report bullying. That single point of entry, it really does make sense. The state can track the amount of bullying incidents. It could be related to giving schools more funding and other support to the school. One of the things that we saw for years is that bullying that was reported was buried. It was buried somewhere. And so there wasn't good response mechanisms to the bullying. There wasn't that safety plan that was created to protect the student. Certainly we want to make sure it's investigated, and that if it's not, then there's the opportunity to file a formal complaint with the state on that. And then there needs to be the support of the counseling for both the bully and the target of bullying. There also might be, if the child is a child with a disability or a Section 504 accommodation plan, there might be some additional accommodations that need to be done for either one of those students. And then make sure that safety plan is working. I think some of the earlier speakers had talked about restorative justice. Absolutely. We need to be looking at restorative practices and restorative justice, because we want students to learn how their behavior affects others. School is a teaching facility, right? We're supposed to be teaching kids in school. Teaching, this is all part of it. And certainly teaching kids about kindness and respect and inclusion and acceptance is all extremely important. And that can be done through a lot of that support and counseling. We also want to encourage all students to be what we call upstanders. In other words, stand up for other kids. Absolutely. And in the moment, not later, in the moment when there's a problem. And then the school has to take those steps necessary, where they provide additional supervision, whether they provide adult assistance, other ways that they can ensure safety for the target of bullying. There's also what they call a same-day parental notification. So once there's an incident in Nevada, in particular, there's a letter that goes to witnesses. It goes to the parents of the bully, or parents of the witnesses, parents of the bully, and parents of the target of bullying. So that notification is essential. Sometimes that can be a little confusing for families, but they do receive information that there is an investigation going on and that their child could be part of that investigation. And then there needs to be a report of findings and some kind of conclusion given to the parents. Now, if the parents don't agree with the findings, for example, the parents believe that a bullying occurred and maybe perhaps the investigation says otherwise, then there can be appeals, and a formal complaints can be filed by families. But the goal is always to make sure that children feel safe at school, and that we find ways to stop the bullying, and that we address it with both children, and that we continue to promote campuses that do not tolerate bullying, and that we can help children recognize how those actions can have some severe effect. You know, my husband still remembers the day he was thrown into a trash can, and he was, I believe, a ninth grader. And when he was growing up, he went to a parochial school and then he went to public school. And his welcome to public school was being turned upside down and put in a trash can. And so it just shows, it's just another illustration about how those experiences live for 30, 40, 50 years. And so we do not want kids to recycle those kind of feelings and those experiences. And so we are certainly here at Nevada PEP are trying to support families as they go through a very difficult time in many instances when they find out their children experience bullying.
How do we locate advocates to help some of these parents navigate some of these policies?
So as a reminder, every state has a parent training and information center. So I'd encourage you to maybe start there. All the parent centers, even though their primary focus is helping families with children with disabilities, they are all certainly in tune with about bullying in their state and the laws that surround bullying. So that's definitely a place to start. That would be idea. Also, you could talk to the Office for Civil Rights if there is a concern that it's harassment in some form. So that is two places to start. Our experience with Office for Civil Rights is that they're great at answering questions. I know that that isn't a common theme with a government agency, but they really are good about letting families know, and parents, you know, maybe can whether there's a complaint that could be filed or if they could look into it. So I would start with that. Remember though, every school district has a state agency. You can also talk to the education agency or the state education agency in your state. And sometimes they will have an Office for Safe and Respectful Learning or another idea of how a bullying is addressed in your state specifically.
One that came up was, how do we deal with bullies once they enter the workplace? And asking for resources to deal with this on the adult to adult level.
Yeah, I think that's an important reminder, right? That bullies don't just become bullies when they're adults. They were probably bullies when they were younger. And I was actually thinking about a previous question as well as that just because something doesn't rise to the level of being illegal or requires us to file a lawsuit doesn't mean that the impact isn't damaging and long lasting. And I think that that's where, you know, waiting for the school to respond or for others to respond often means that you're dealing with, in an employment situation, HR, or in the school environment, you're waiting for administration or school counselors. And these are all places that will likely be looking into Title IX and looking at the legality and what their responsibilities are. And that while that is happening, the child is still hurting. The employee is still hurting and damaged. So I'd really encourage folks to reach out, you know, in thinking about how do we center the harm that has been done? How do we reduce suffering as quickly and as effectively as possible? It's, you know, counseling services for sure, support groups, connecting folks as quickly as possible. One of the benefits of social media today is that it is very quick to connect people with others who can validate, support, and offer at least a shoulder or, you know, another perspective that might be similar. So I would definitely make sure that the harm is cared for, that the person is held while they are waiting for these higher order responses. The other part is that, you know, remembering that workplaces, I've recently had to do some expert witness work around hostile workplace environments. And one of the things that is very clear is that you cannot have a toxic workplace culture, right? But there is no definition for what constitutes a hostile workplace. And so right now, scholars are very are trying to define what constitutes a hostile workplace. And a hostile workplace is one where you cannot function, you cannot be productive. And so I really think that it is about identifying these underlying behaviors that allow people to lack civility, right? So really looking into how do people mistreat each other, disrespect each other in kind of simple ways, right? And I think that that's true in schools as well, that if you cannot address the small ways in which people invalidate one another, harass one another on a day-to-day basis, you are allowing it to escalate to a point where it is harm, all of it is harmful, but really now you have to really act. So working to address the smaller levels. And I do, as a parent, also realize no one cares. No one at the schools that I work with care about the small things. And I think that's where I hope researchers, agencies, and parents really begin to work together to show schools that it is the small, it is the micro that is so damaging. It is the things that happen in social media. It is the ways that you belittle people that will turn into the bigger behaviors. You are telling bullies that it is acceptable to treat people as less than when they're allowed to do the little things, and then it will escalate. And then we'll see it in the workplace. I'm not sure I addressed it completely, but yes, wrongful termination, I would say that is retaliation, and you should report that. That's not to say that anything will be done, but wrongful termination, especially if you can document that it's directly related to speaking up, is considered retaliation. And based on my own work, I know that the very few cases of wrongful termination ever get corrected. But you should know that scholars would classify that as retaliation.
How do you identify bullying and abuse when the senior is isolated and perhaps living with the abuser?
That can be really hard. And what we like to tell when we go out in the community and we work with older adults, we like to tell people that it's really great if they can have people who know them that either call regularly or are able to drop by. Because if you have that, then if something looks out of what's typical for that person, it can be noticed. And that's hard because, right, obviously isolation means that there's probably not a lot of people coming by and doing that. But whether it's like a buddy system with a weekly call where you check in with each other, or if people feel safe and comfortable actually going out into community again, then a coffee date or something. And also keeping regular appointments. So making sure you do keep your medical appointments and get to them. And hairdressing appointment or whatever is your regular normal, because even if it's not like heavy, meaningful contact with someone that you have this deep, meaningful relationship with, those simple contacts and the little social interaction help prevent the isolation and also alert someone like, hey, how come they haven't been here recently? Or I wonder if they're okay. Maybe I should call and check on them. And so a lot of that is hard because it involves reaching out and being vulnerable. And I think that's one of the, hardest things that we can do sometimes is be vulnerable. And so when I do this presentation when I present on elder abuse with older adults, I like to frame it this way. It can feel really hard to ask for help. But if one of my friends came to me and asked me for help, I would do everything that I can within my powers to say yes to things I can help them with. And I would be honest if it's something that I can't. But if someone did ask me, my reaction would be, this is my friend, I care about them, I want to help. And we have to remember that when we're the one who needs help. And we have to be brave and we have to ask, because if we don't ask, we can't get it.
How do we handle bullies who use their parents' rank or status in the community, either as a means to put others down and maybe even to hide behind that power?
There are many times where parents use their rank on status for a variety of types of things. Bullying just might be one of them. Again, though, no one deserves to be bullied. And so I think the laws are on your side. And so rank really shouldn't be a factor, but especially in smaller towns and communities, it can be a lot more difficult. I mean, I can say it shouldn't happen, but that doesn't mean it doesn't. I would acknowledge that can be a problem. And I think once again, though, if we're all operating with respect and kindness and acceptance and inclusion, we should be able to deal with that and certainly try to put a stop to that.
Pardon me.
I was just going to add that, you know, an environment that allows that to happen lacks the integrity, you know, of
Mhm.
a place that where everyone matters equally. And I think, you know, those of us, I know I've used my rank and status when I've tried to ensure that my kid's school realizes who they're talking to. And it also, you know, and it when it doesn't work, I'm just like, okay, so they don't really care about what the evidence says around bullying and my perspective here, and that's telling, you know. So I would say that that's an important feature here, is that if the student has learned that their parents' rank matters, and then the school also indicates that it matters, then it probably does matter, and you have a bigger issue on your hands.
And seeing that we're at our time, as you can see, we sure fit a lot of content and great learning. I know I'm walking away with new learning, and so I hope this has been helpful to you all. I want a huge thank you to our panelists